Welcome to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. They say that age is just a number. How about 13,500? That's the number of age-defying feat that 104-year-old Dorothy Hoffner traveled after jumping out of a plane. 104 years old, the oldest skydiver ever. Quite an achievement. But first, these.
No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law.
Donald Trump's achievements were constantly overstated, says a judge at the start of his civil trial.
There is chaos in House Republicans. What we saw this weekend should not have happened.
Achieving the bare minimum. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy averted a government shutdown. Now what? And the Supreme Court starts a new term. Gun rights, race, free speech, government power, and abortion. A docket full of tough issues. We begin our report with truth and consequences in two New York courtrooms this week. The trials begin for Donald Trump and FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried, both of whom face charges. They committed fraud, building empires out of hyperbole and deceit. We start with CBS News chief elections and campaign correspondent Robert Costa.
Former President Donald Trump sat stone-faced in court this morning. The fate of his New York properties, including Trump Tower, and his family business at stake. New York Attorney General Letitia James, who brought the $250 million fraud lawsuit against Trump and his adult children, sat just feet away from the former president and his son Eric.
No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law.
Trump used the occasion to attack James and the judge.
We have a racist attorney general who's a horror show, who ran on the basis that she was going to get Trump before she even knew anything about me.
Trump is accused of misrepresenting his net worth by over $3.5 billion, inflating his assets to secure better loan terms. He allegedly claimed his Trump Tower penthouse was nearly 3 times its size and valued Mar-a-Lago as high as $739 million, nearly 10 times its worth, according to James's office. Attorney Kevin Wallace told the judge they were lying year after year after year. Trump's former fixer Michael Cohen said in a deposition played in court that he and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg were tasked with inflating assets to obtain the number that Trump wanted.
Let's say it said he was worth $6 billion. Well, he wanted to be higher on the Forbes list. And he then said, I'm actually not worth $6 billion. I'm worth 7. In fact, I think it's actually now worth 8.
Trump attorney Chris Kise called Cohen a serial liar and said everyone has a different opinion as to valuation.
It's a sham.
The former president called the trial rigged and a witch hunt, days after the judge ruled he had committed fraud.
What we have here is an attempt to hurt me in an election.
And Robert Costa joins me now from outside the courthouse in New York City. Bob, help us understand why there is no jury in this case, why it's just before a judge, why that's the case, and how that will affect the proceedings in an eventual ruling.
John, always great to be with you. This is an unusual legal circumstance for former President Donald Trump. He's not facing a jury trial. Instead, it's a civil lawsuit trial, and he's being sued by the Attorney General of New York. But the Attorney General is making statements through her lawyers today. That Office of the Attorney General has a case against Trump that he defrauded people for years by making these valuations of his company. But ultimately, it's the judge in this case who is going to have final say. And in part, this is because the judge said today in the courtroom, and I was sitting just steps away when he said it, the Trump lawyers didn't request a jury trial in this civil circumstance. And so right now, it's all in the hands of this judge. Of course, Trump could appeal down the line should it not go his way. But right now, this judge has a very powerful grip over Trump's future in terms of his businesses and his brand.
So it could have been a jury trial if they had asked for one. This is all happening in the middle of a primary race. Of course, you reported last week about Republican donors looking outside of the current field. What's the temperature of that nervousness right now of those donors looking outside of the current field? And are they still looking at the governor of Virginia?
There's a sense among many of the top donors in the country, some privately to me, some publicly went on the record, that something needs to happen if they don't support Trump as the nominee. They want to see an alternative emerge. Some of them have strong support, or at least hopeful support, for people like Nikki Haley, the former ambassador, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. But there's a fear in the anti-Trump coalition, among traditional Republicans in particular, that if nothing starts to happen by November, then maybe Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, should he get a bounce by the off-year elections in Virginia, could be considered to enter the race. Of course, this would be a slapdash scheme. It takes a lot of effort to get on the ballot in so many of these heavy delegate states that you really need to win or do well in to compete against Trump down the line. So a lot's in the air, but there's a lot of fear. I mean, former retired General John Kelly just told CNN that Trump is someone who could be a real danger to the republic, and he said, God help us. Just moments ago, that was published. And that's really the sense I find from many traditional Republicans.
The Haley and DeSantis campaigns are, they've been invited to pitch some of these wealthy donors to a network of Republican mega donors next week. How does something, let's imagine one of them did well. First of all, what does doing well look like in that context, if it's possible to know? And secondly, let's say one of them does well. What's the door prize? What do they get, and how helpful might that be?
Ultimately, the prize is going to be survival in the race. You need money to survive. You need money to compete, money to have a staff, and consolidation. There's got to be a push for consolidation in the race. That's the echo and the refrain I hear from so many of the major donors in this country and the veteran strategists who don't like Trump, that until this race consolidates among somebody in it who's currently running, then nothing happens against Trump, because the anti-Trump vote is split. Senator Mitt Romney and I had a good interview a few weeks ago, and he said, look, whether it's Youngkin or anybody else, you can get in, but if the field is big, that whole vote is still split. And so there's a sense of paralysis among the anti-Trump Republicans about what can be done. And at this point, there's also a sense of resignation among a lot of them, John, that nothing can be done.
All right. Robert Costa outside the Manhattan courthouse delivering it. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal trial is set to begin Tuesday. The former crypto billionaire is accused of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering, charges that could earn him a combined 110 years in prison. The trial is expected to last about 6 weeks. A number of FTX insiders and executives, including Bankman-Fried's ex-girlfriend Caroline Ellison, are expected to testify against him. This weekend, lawmakers in Washington managed to prevent a government shutdown rather than cause one. The last-minute temporary funding deal comes with consequences for House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, though, after fellow Republican Florida Representative Matt Gaetz filed a resolution Monday to oust him. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane has more.
48 hours after a shutdown that would have stripped the paychecks of millions of federal workers.
The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy risks being stripped of his job. Florida Republican Matt Gaetz, a notoriously fierce critic, is planning an attempt to oust the speaker, slamming him for working with Democrats.
It is going to be difficult for my Republican friends to keep calling President Biden feeble while he continues to take Speaker McCarthy's lunch money in every negotiation.
Despite being pressed by CBS News, Democratic leaders haven't said if they'd join the effort to target McCarthy. If they did, only a handful of his Republican colleagues need to vote against McCarthy to put him in danger.
It is what it is, and I'm going to just focus on what the American people want.
Americans and counting.
Some Republicans are also calling for the ouster and prosecution of New York Democrat Jamal Bowman, a former middle school principal who they accuse of pulling a House office building fire alarm to delay the tense proceedings Saturday. Bowman apologized and said he thought the alarm would open a locked doorway as he rushed to votes. The House Administration Committee and U.S. Capitol Police are investigating. Meanwhile, President Biden is urging Congress to restore aid for Ukraine.
Too many lives are at stake, too many children, too many people.
Which was cut this weekend to appease some conservative Republicans who think taxpayers have spent enough. Is there any risk in waiting to provide that aid?
Certainly on the battlefield, but more importantly, the risk comes in what our partner nations are saying.
And Scott McFarlane joins me now from Capitol Hill. Scott, the next deadline, November 17th. What happens between now and then, and especially with respect to this question of Ukraine? The president seemed to suggest that he had some kind of an agreement with the House Speaker. The House Speaker maybe is not on board with that. What's the story?
This feels like such a bunch of aftershocks after the weekend earthquake. Like, things keep rattling here, even though we've got a 45-day deal to keep the government open. Let's start with that Ukraine question. The Republican who wants to oust Speaker McCarthy, Matt Gaetz of Florida, accuses McCarthy of cutting a secret side deal with the White House guaranteeing Ukraine money before the end of the year. Kevin McCarthy, speaking to CBS and other reporters tonight, said no, there's no secret side deal. The president, though, made an allusion to a possible agreement with Speaker McCarthy. And today, as he left the White House to shouted questions from reporters, he did not respond. Just the accusation that McCarthy and the president have a deal is going to cause more trouble for Speaker McCarthy, who's under fire, John, for what? For cutting deals with the White House on the government spending and earlier this year on the debt ceiling.
And, Scott, speaking of the trouble that the House Speaker is in, we are at an extraordinary moment here. This motion to vacate that might be filed by Matt Gaetz, which would bring his speakership, which would bring Speaker McCarthy's speakership into peril. What's the status of that? And what's the next step after that vote, if that vote takes place? We're in uncharted territory here.
We sure are. I asked Matt Gaetz 3 times today, when are you filing this motion you threatened to try to oust Speaker McCarthy? And he kept telling me this week, sometime this week, sometime this week. Until he files that, let me be clear, some of this is real middle schoolish. He says, she said, people having a game of telephone, talking about what somebody wants and somebody else wants. It's really unclear. After it's filed, it gets very serious. Ultimately, if Democrats agree that they'd like to see a challenge to Speaker McCarthy too, all Matt Gaetz needs is about 4 or 5 Republicans to join him. That's not many, and McCarthy has far more critics inside his conference than that. If it happens, there comes a political scramble where people are jockeying potentially for votes. McCarthy's confident he keeps his speakership even if that thing is filed by Matt Gaetz. But if it is, it's disruptive. It's a distraction at a very sensitive moment, John. There are only a month and a half until the next deadline to keep the government open. There's all kinds of acrimony. There's all kinds of challenges. And to be clear, John, we're in the same spot we were weeks ago, where Republicans want to cut federal spending significantly, especially Democratic priorities. The Senate won't buy that. The president won't buy that. We're on a course towards another shutdown. The last thing this city needs is more needless acrimony.
Yes, a distraction in the middle of a distraction. Scott MacFarlane, thanks so much.
Thank you.
California Governor Gavin Newsom has chosen LaFonza Butler to fill the late Dianne Feinstein's U.S. Senate seat. Butler is the president of Emily's List, an organization that works to elect Democratic women who support abortion rights. She also has served as a senior advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris during the 2020 presidential campaign. Governor Newsom spoke Monday about his decision.
I am proud and honored to have had so many extraordinarily qualified people that expressed interest in this job. And I could not be more proud of LaFonza's interest in her qualifications and her willingness to do this.
Feinstein's casket was taken to San Francisco Saturday, where she served 10 years as the city's mayor. Her funeral is set for this Thursday. As the summer of the strike becomes the year of the strike, a handful of labor actions are in various stages of development. Negotiations continued Monday for striking actors and auto workers. Meanwhile, healthcare and culinary employees could soon join them on the picket lines. And after the writers' strike ended last week, late-night television is returning. CBS News correspondent Elise Preston reports.
They're back.
Anything happened in the last 5 months?
With writers again on the job, late-night talk shows have returned. While one Hollywood strike is settled, today the actors and production companies are back at the bargaining table. They've been out since July.
If they gave in to all the union's demands, it would barely make a dent in their profits.
Because everything has gone up but salaries, bread, rent.
Yeah. That's been a nearly universal theme as workers hit the picket lines around the country.
Union strike!
UAW strike now in its 18th day. A strike of more than 40,000 culinary workers in Las Vegas appears imminent.
The ability to own a home and your kids do better than you, nobody's talking about that anymore.
And on Wednesday, 75,000 Kaiser Permanente workers in 5 states are poised to walk out. This map shows how many strikes are currently active. The number of workers who have been out on strike this year up nearly tenfold from 2021. In recent decades, worker pay has increased 18%. For the nation's top CEOs, it's gone up a staggering 1,400%. And even when there's labor peace, the message is still clear.
So the Writers Guild went on strike and thankfully won. But it took a lot of sacrifices from a lot of people to achieve that.
It's not just the striking workers who are impacted by coast-to-coast labor actions. The ripple effect of just the Hollywood and United Auto Workers strikes is a nearly $10 billion loss to the U.S. economy. John?
Elise Preston, thank you. Coming up, a decades-old conflict reignites violently. Two men set off a bomb on the doorstep of a Turkish government building in the heart of the country's capital. Hours later, a well-known group claimed responsibility. And the docket has been set. We'll take a look at some of the most important and controversial cases of the new Supreme Court term. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. A 9-year-old girl who went missing at a New York State park over the weekend has been found alive and in good health. Charlotte Senna was last seen in Moreau Lake State Park Saturday when she went biking and never returned. New York State Police say a suspect is in custody but did not provide further details. Police are still calling it an active investigation. The Supreme Court returned for its new term on Monday with several potentially major cases ahead. This session, the court will hear 2 First Amendment cases involving social media content regulation, a Second Amendment case on the gun rights of domestic abusers, another racial gerrymandering case, this time over South Carolina's congressional map. Additionally, the court will hear arguments on restricting the power of federal agencies and Purdue Pharma's massive bankruptcy settlement. For more on this packed term, let's bring in Jimmy Hoover. He's a Supreme Court reporter at the National Law Journal. Jimmy, the first case is about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's being argued on Tuesday. What's at stake in that case that might have repercussions all across the executive branch?
Yeah, as you say, it's a pretty big deal for the executive branch. This is another one that is kind of a challenge to what conservatives like to call the administrative state, the alphabet soup of federal agencies that police all manner of industries. This one involving the CFPB, which is the cop on the beat for the consumer financial sector. Things like the regulations for credit cards, payday loans, other things involving people's pocketbooks. So that's a case that has to do with the way that the CFPB was actually set up after the 2008 financial crisis, when it was kind of the brainchild of Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Congress decided that they were going to set up some pretty independent funding for the CFPB. So it's not necessarily tied to annual appropriations in Congress. This has the effect of insulating it from the political winds. And as you can imagine, that makes a lot of regulated companies pretty upset. So they've brought this challenge, and the Supreme Court's going to review the constitutionality of that independent funding structure.
Right. The CFPB says that gives them independence. Critics say that means they answer to no one. Let's go now. For the first time in U.S. history, the Supreme Court is thinking about adopting an ethics code for justices. There's been a lot of questions about Justice Clarence Thomas principally, but also Justice Sotomayor, Samuel Alito. What do we know about the state of those ethics rules?
We know very little. As Justice Elena Kagan recently said, what goes on in the Supreme Court's conference room stays there. So we don't know exactly what kind of discussions are happening, or really who's the holdout, what's holding it up. But Kagan and others have suggested that this is a conversation that they're happening, and some justices on the court, for instance Kagan, think that it would be a good idea to kind of nip some of this criticism in the bud and for the Supreme Court to adopt its own ethics code. The justices of the Supreme Court, despite being the most powerful jurists in the country, are the only federal judges not subject to a binding ethics code. And so in the wake of a lot of media reporting about some of the off-court activities of justices like Clarence Thomas, there's a lot of scrutiny of the justices' ethical behavior, in particular from Democratic members of the Senate and Congress. And so this would be a way for them to essentially kind of take preemptive control over the conversation and potentially put some of these controversies to rest. But we don't know when it's going to happen.
I went through a long list of cases the court's considering. What other cases is the court or are the justices still considering that might come onto that already busy schedule?
Yeah, you hit the big ones, John. I would just say to keep an eye out for a big case involving the abortion drug mifepristone, which is in the petition stage, meaning the justices are considering whether to review this case. Now, this is this would be, it would be the biggest abortion case to hit the court since the Dobbs ruling, which overturned Roe versus Wade. But mifepristone is a huge issue for the court right now to consider, and with the Biden administration asking the Supreme Court to essentially reinstate full access to the abortion drug before a lower court of appeals restricted that access, there's a decent chance that the Supreme Court's going to intervene and decide to take this case up, which would put a big decision on abortion right in the middle of the 2024 campaign season in the end of June.
And finally, Jimmy, before I let you go, the 14th Amendment. The court has declined to consider an effort to disqualify former President Donald Trump from running for president again. Somebody brought up a 14th Amendment case. Remind people what that is really quickly, and then why did the court not take it up, or even, it seems, take it very seriously?
Yeah, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified after the Civil War, has a line in it that essentially prohibits people who were engaged in an insurrection against the United States from holding office. Now, kind of a popular legal academic debate du jour is whether that can be applied to essentially take Trump out of the 2024 election. You mentioned the Supreme Court. They rejected a long shot appeal to do just that this morning, along with several other appeals related to controversies over elections. There was another one from John Eastman, the former Thomas clerk, and election denier who had petitioned the court to essentially vacate a ruling that let his emails be obtained by the January 6th committee, but put this one down as another long shot appeal that probably had very little chance of succeeding in the first place. And it's just another example of the Supreme Court not wanting to necessarily go out of its way to get involved in political controversies when it doesn't necessarily need to.
Jimmy Hoover of the National Law Journal, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
As Jimmy just mentioned, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recused himself from a decision involving former Trump lawyer John Eastman and efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The High Court Monday refused to hear Eastman's request to undo a ruling that had allowed the now disbanded House January 6 committee to see emails Eastman claimed were shielded by attorney-client privilege. Justice Thomas did not give a reason for recusing himself, though, as Jimmy Hoover just mentioned, one might be that Eastman was a former Thomas clerk. Thomas has faced criticism in the past for ruling in favor of Donald Trump and his allies on other January 6th cases. His wife, Ginny Thomas, was a central figure in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Two scientists whose discoveries led to the eventual creation of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine are the newest winners of the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Scientists Drew Weissman and Catalin Carrico shared their story at Monday's ceremony.
We would sit together in 1997 and afterwards and talk about all of the things that we thought RNA could do, all of the vaccines and therapeutics and gene therapies, and just realizing how important it had the potential to be.
Their story began when they met by chance at the University of Pennsylvania while making copies at a Xerox machine. Together, they worked on a 2005 research paper that led to the groundbreaking vaccine 15 years later. In Chicago this Sunday, a woman ditched her walker on the tarmac and yelled, "Let's go, Geronimo," before embarking on a history-making skydive. At 104 years old, a former phone operator named Dorothy Hoffner became the oldest person to make a tandem jump from a plane, taking the record from a 103-year-old Swedish woman. Hoffner began skydiving at age 100, but this was the first time she led the jump instead of being pushed. And she's not done. Hoffner's planning her first hot air balloon trip for her 105th birthday this December. But That flight won't quite be record-breaking because the title is held by a 109-year-old woman from Iowa who also decided to seize Guinness records in her golden years. Congress may have avoided a shutdown, but it dropped funding for Ukraine in the process. Coming up, how the spending debate in Washington could affect the battlefield. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Here are some additions to our top stories. Donald Trump's New York City civil fraud trial kicked off Monday. Trump called it election interference, saying it's keeping him from the campaign trail. The former president is not required to attend the trial in person. Indeed, he did not attend court proceedings for the sexual abuse and defamation civil case in New York he faced earlier this year. The union representing film and TV actors is back at the bargaining table with Hollywood studios after more than 80 days on strike. The two sides announced they would start negotiations the same day the Writers Guild of America officially ended its nearly 5-month-long strike. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz filed a resolution Monday to oust Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Gaetz had been threatening to make the move for months, but the conflict came to a head after McCarthy relied on Democrats to approve a short-term government funding bill. The House leadership now has 2 days to act on the resolution, which could mean anything from a vote to simply killing it. As we've been reporting, Congress prevented a self-inflicted government shutdown over the weekend. The funding bill President Biden signed minutes before the deadline did not include any funding for Ukraine. The president wants Congress to rectify that and fast. How much the aid should be approved and whether it can pass the Republican-led House is unclear.
We cannot, under any circumstance, allow American support for Ukraine to be interrupted.
American border takes priority. There are more Americans being killed because of the southern border than there are for Ukraine. I have always supported arming Ukraine. It's not sending money to Ukraine, that's arming Ukraine with the weaponry to defend it.
Let's bring in Elise Labott. She is the founder and editor of Zivi News and a professor at American University School of International Service. Elise, thanks so much for being with us. How vital is the funding that didn't make it into the continuing resolution?
John, it's vital. You know that President Zelensky was here just about a month ago, and Chuck Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, was saying that he told him if they don't get this funding, they're going to lose the war. Now, you know, aid to Ukraine has roughly support of 2/3 of both houses. There has been about, $43.1 billion already towards the military effort. There's about, I don't know, 5 to 6,000 left in the till for the rest of the year. But with this counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are on right now against Russia, that won't be done by the end of the year. So they really need in these 45 days to get that funding passed.
And is it your sense that the funding is endangered completely? In other words, the spigot is off? Or that this is a kind of step in what will be a reduction of funding, which, as you've just suggested, is going in the wrong direction with respect to the way Ukraine sees it, because they need more money now?
Well, it's certainly going in the wrong direction if there's any less funding than the Ukrainians have been promised or that the Ukrainians need. But you got to see that when we had this vote the other day, but we say that, both houses support it, 2/3 of the Congress, but more Republicans voted against Ukraine aid than voted for it. So it does reflect a broader turn in the Republican opinion. I think CBS even had a poll recently with YouGov that, most Republicans are saying that the U.S. should be sending less money, not more, to Ukraine. So I do think, even Senator McCarthy said that he does support more aid to Ukraine, and he will get that package done. But as you saw, he's kind of conditioning aid for the border and for more border security to get that funding for Ukraine passed. He's really holding it hostage, if you will.
Zanny Minton-Beddoes of The Economist interviewed Zelensky, and he said, when he talks to donors in the United States and in Europe, they say we're still with you, but he notices there's a little less, fire in their eyes. What's your sense of donor fatigue and how that was connected to, if the United States is going wobbly, what signal does that send to the coalition of partners who've been supporting the effort in Ukraine?
Well, there's a lot of things going on. First of all, the U.S. economically hasn't had a great year with inflation and raising oil prices and the cost of goods at home. So Americans are really feeling the heat. So when you say, oh, we have to keep supporting Ukraine, in theory, they really do support, but they're looking at their own paychecks and their own pocketbook, and they're saying, look, we also have to think of ourselves. And that's also happening around the world. I mean, the EU has been the second largest donor to Ukraine. You saw today that all 27 foreign ministers, after Congress had this vote over the weekend to show support for Ukraine, all foreign ministers had this big EU meeting. And they do support Ukraine, but they're not going to be able to make up the shortfall. So I do think, you know, if this war is going to go on for a very long time, as most people suspect it will, the Ukrainians have had some setbacks, they've had some advances, but it's certainly not going to happen right away. I think there's going to be more pressure on the U.S. to, you know, kind of stabilize funding, more pressure to have a diplomatic solution. And that's not just going to be in the U.S., but in European publics as well.
At least just quickly at the end here, I've been asking abstract questions about money, but these are real human lives in a gritty, bloody war. What is your sense of the current state of things in the invasion into Ukraine and how the Ukrainians are doing in their counteroffensive?
Well, like I said, they've had advances and they've had setbacks. They do feel that the wind is in their sails. I was actually just meeting with one man. He's a tech entrepreneur from San Francisco, a Ukrainian who has kind of gone back to the war efforts. And he says, look, you know, you don't see the progress on the map, so to speak, but they are hitting Russian supply lines. They are hitting, you know, the Russians where they are. But one thing I think you're going to hear about in the coming months is non-lethal aid. You know, you have these very expensive weapons defense systems, ammunitions, actual like hardware. But there's like a lot of non-lethal aid, whether it's technologies, generators, batteries, even, you know, kind of portable electronics that can help the Ukrainians map the area that'll make them make advances much sooner and kind of make up the shortfall for what they feel is like the lack of, you know, heavy artillery and heavy weapons. So I think you're going to hear a little bit more of that. And John, these are things you can buy at Costco, you can buy on Craigslist. They're more commercial goods and they're less expensive. They're readily available. So I think, you know, as there's going to be this pressure to give those big weapon systems, I think everyone's going to start looking at how are other ways they can help the Ukrainians advance. And they think they can do it. You've seen that there's no, you know, the Ukrainians, it does hurt morale when something like this happens over the weekend, but they're very united, they're very determined, and they feel like as long as the world can stay with them, they really do feel optimistic that they can beat the Russians. I think it's just about political will around the world and whether they're going to help the Ukrainians get there.
Elise Labott, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah.
The United Nations Security Council has approved an additional security force for Haiti, a year after the country first asked for one. It's an attempt to curb gang violence and weapons trafficking in the Caribbean nation. 1,000 police officers from Kenya will make up a majority of the force. Several of Haiti's neighbors, including Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas and Jamaica, have also pledged support. The force has plans to stay for a year, but it's not clear when they will be deployed. The UN faces deep skepticism in Haiti after a previous mission resulted in a cholera outbreak that killed more than 9,000 people. Officials say a suicide bomber affiliated with the Kurdish militants set off an explosive device Sunday near Turkey's Interior Ministry building in Ankara. The attack happened just hours before the Turkish parliament was set to reopen after its summer recess. 2 officers were injured. The second assailant was shot by police. An organization known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, has claimed responsibility for the bombing. The group has been fighting the Turkish government for nearly 4 decades in an attempt to create an independent Kurdistan. Poland's opposition party says 1 million people attended a political march over the weekend to motivate voters ahead of an election this month. The leader of the liberal PO party says the march shows a desire to break from a conservative government. The country's conservative PIS party has been in charge since 2015, but has faced growing opposition. Poland has faced criticism by the EU for passing laws that tighten immigration rules, and more recently for enacting controversial judicial reforms. Those reforms led the EU to withholding billions of COVID recovery funds from Poland. After a 3-year pause, student loan payments are due again. It will be a big burden for some borrowers and for the government. That's next. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Tens of millions of Americans are expected to resume paying student loans after a 3-year pandemic-era pause. CBS News correspondent Carter Evans has more.
Hey, payments start again in October.
The constant reminders are inundating Manuel Galindo's inbox. The Berkeley grad owes more than $28,000 on federal student loans.
I'm now in more debt than the amount of money I've ever had in my pocket.
Galindo grew up poor in South LA, raised by immigrant parents from El Salvador.
I can recall sleeping on a mattress with my 3 other siblings and my parents on a second mattress on the floor, and that's all we had.
Now, the 31-year-old has his dream job at a nonprofit that fights for borrowers. He makes about $80,000 a year, but much of that goes to support other family members. Restarting loan payments will mean painful cuts.
$200-300 is the difference between me being able to purchase medical coverage or me being able to pay for my family's food.
Or being able to rent this house.
What's going to change when you have to start paying this loan back?
I'm giving up the house.
So what are you going to do?
Couch surf.
Repayments are due for 43 million borrowers. Spending analysis firm Numerator found most will start cutting back on vacations and restaurants. As a last resort, some will have to cut essentials, like groceries.
This is going to pull out about $6.5 billion per month from consumer spending. The question is, will it reduce inflation, but at the same time increase unemployment?
Until his student debt is settled, Galindo can achieve his ultimate goal, buying a home for his parents.
Just the thought of being able to give my parents that key, we've never had that.
And right now, the number of deceptive robocalls and emails is soaring, some from scammers offering to erase student debt for a fee. If you've got any questions, the Federal Trade Commission says you should contact your loan servicer directly. John.
Carter Evans, thank you. For more, let's bring in Michael Stratford. He's an education reporter at Politico. Michael, we've just heard how restarting loan payments could contribute to less consumer spending. In a consumer economy, that could be a problem. What is the economic effect of all of this money possibly moving out of the spending?
Yeah, that's right. As you mentioned, tens of millions of Americans are facing student loan bills this fall for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. That's billions of dollars of new monthly payments that they'll collectively have to make. And the question is, where are they going to find the room in their budget to make those payments? The question is whether they're cutting back on retail spending, going to restaurants. And if they do, that will put a drag on consumer spending, which is a big component, of course, of economic growth in this country. And some of the estimates we've seen are that GDP, this could subtract a 0.25 percentage point, a 0.5 percentage point off of GDP in the last quarter of this year. Most economists and analysts I've spoken to don't think that the student loan restart in isolation is going to shake the economy. But it's also coming at a time where there are other headwinds in the economy, high inflation, high interest rates. We just avoided a government shutdown, but that threat still looms out there. And of course, the impact for individual families and individual people could be significant in some cases.
Michael, what's the logistical challenge for the federal government of turning this program back on after it's been off for 3 years?
Yeah, after this deep freeze, the government is going to have to thaw out the federal student loan program, which even before the pandemic was far from a well-oiled machine. There were lots of problems. 1 million borrowers a year were defaulting despite the availability of relief programs. This is a big task for the Department of Education, the Biden administration. They say that 28 million people are going to be restarting payments this month. That's more than 5 times the number of borrowers who enter repayment in any given year. And it's a huge task. We're already hearing from borrowers that their loan servicers have delays in paperwork processing. They're having to wait for hours in some cases to reach a real person on the other end of the line to manage their loan and make arrangements to repay. So this is a huge task for the administration.
And the Biden administration is trying to lessen the blow with a 12-month on-ramp to ease the payment burden. How does that work?
That's right. They're doing two main things to try to lessen the blow for student loan borrowers making payments for the first time this fall. The first is they're advertising their income-driven repayment program to get borrowers to be able to lower their payment and in some cases get some subsidies on their interest. And the second major thing they're doing is this on-ramp period. It's essentially a forbearance period. Typically, if you don't pay your student loan, the federal government reports you to a credit bureau on the third month, and that could tank your credit score. The administration is saying that they're going to have some more flexibility for borrowers entering repayment now. They're not going to report borrowers to credit bureaus for the first 12 months. Essentially, borrowers won't be able to go delinquent. But importantly, interest is still going to continue to accrue on their loans during that time. So it's a bit of flexibility, but not a total free pass.
Michael Stratford, education reporter for Politico. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back. In the city of love, no one is safe. That's according to the mayor of Paris, who was referring to the city's bedbug infestation. The tiny pests were first seen in hotels and vacation rental apartments this summer. More recently, they've been spotted in movie theaters and Paris's metro and national train systems. The outbreak comes about 10 months before Paris is set to host the 2024 Olympics. City officials are calling on the government to step in and help put together a plan to protect the city and travelers. New images of the Orion Nebula taken by the James Webb Space Telescope have been released, allowing you to explore the stars on your own. The Orion Nebula is one of the brightest formations in the sky just south of Orion's belt. These stunning wide-angle images were taken in infrared and have been incorporated into the European Space Agency's ESA Sky application, so you can take a closer look for yourself. Up next, it's Eye on America. For all of us here at CBS News Primetime, that's our report. I'm John Dickerson. Thank you for spending the hour with us.